Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the penultimate event for Season 2 or Day 2 of Transmediale before we move to the HKV tomorrow. It's an immense pleasure and honor for me to share the stage with Amer Kanngieser and Sinthujan Varatharajah. I'd like to take a moment to introduce our two guests, although to some of you they need little to no introduction. And then speak a bit about the framework and context of the conversation, its namesake installation upstairs in the Kupelhalle. Sorry, I'm trying to figure out the lighting, it's a bit difficult. Sinthujan is a political geographer, researcher, and essayist based in Berlin. Their work explores many things. This is just a small taste. Statelessness, mobility, and displacement with a focus on infrastructure, logistics, and architecture. Amer Kanngieser is an award-winning geographer and sound artist, working through listening and attunement to approach the relations between people, place, and ecologies. Over the past decade, they have focused on experimenting with sonic methods and practices, including field recordings, radio building and training, sonic ethnographies, oral testimonies, songs, sonifications, composition, sound walks, for environmental geographical research. These methods and their application have been developed through sound events with institutions and festivals, of which there are too many to name at the moment. Since 2015, Amer has been collaborating with Pacific women, queer and transgender artists, organizers, and scholars through Climates of Listening, an ongoing project that amplifies movements for self-determination in relation to continuing colonization through resource extraction, environmental racism, and ecological disaster. This research emphasizes the nuanced and variegated ways that communities and people understand, produce knowledge about, and collectively attend to their lived experiences of ecocide. This has included running podcast production workshops with groups in Fiji and the Marshall Islands, for which an introduction to podcasting manual was compiled with the Fijian audio producers Mira Nila Tikau and Crystal Lavaki Danford from the Two Fishes show. And I mention this also because Mira is one of the collaborators of the show upstairs. Like refraction of light, a change in direction caused by a change in speed that is knowable and measurable once a ray of light enters water, in Oceanic Refractions, the installation and the conversation, Amer and Sinthujan will train their respective lenses on the politics of disaster visibility and the allure of environmental content to examine how images, ideas, projections, even fantasies of the climate crisis are leveraged and adapted to defer the responsibility for climate crises from global systems of violence onto acts of moral goodness to be done at the scale of individual acts of moral goodness. So staring into the space between how climate change is experienced and how it is imaged, we find the erasure of the causes and reasons for the unfolding ecocide along the so-called front lines. So perhaps we can start the conversation with a seemingly deceptively straightforward question, and we can start with Amer, and the format of the conversation will really be quite loose and free-flowing as it goes throughout the hour. So we'll start with a question for Amer. How did the Oceanic Refractions project start and why?
Yeah, that is a very deceptively simple question that hides a lot in there. So the Oceanic Refractions project, which is currently the installation that is playing in the Kupelhalle at the moment, is based on, I'm not mentally cognizant to do the maths now. It started in 2015, so what is that, like 8 years ago now. So 9 years ago? I don't even know. It started a really long time ago. It started in 2015, and it kind of came through conversations that I was having with a group of queer and transgender grassroots organisers in Fiji around disaster relief. And in 2016, Cyclone Winston hit Fiji, and it was the worst cyclone to hit the Pacific Islands in living history. It was it devastated Fiji and a number of other islands, and one of the things that I was working with the community groups around was the lack of accessibility and resources for transgender and queer people. And this was for a number of reasons, one of which was, due to the legacies and histories of Christian missionization and moralism around transgender and queer people across the region. But so I went over there and was introduced to a lot of people that they were working with, along with another very strident anti-colonial, anti-extractives group called Pang Fiji. And they put me in contact with a number of different grassroots, anti-colonial organising across the region in Nauru, Papua New Guinea, the Marshall Islands, and in Kiribati. And probably for most of you here, you have no idea where those places are. And if you do know, it's, maybe something that you know about islands that are sinking or people that are drowning, places that are no longer set to exist anymore. But, there are very, very militant and vibrant organising movements that are happening there and have been happening through the decolonisation process since the 1960s and 70s, and obviously well before then too. So I was put in touch with people and had the enormous privilege and pleasure to work with a number of elders and chiefs in a number of different villages and places, particularly around their campaigns against deep seabed mining. And a lot of our conversations turned very much to the role of silence and listening in terms of environmental kinship and relationality, and the different kinds of ways of silence and listening that different Indigenous Pacific cultures practice in order to be in what people like Métis scholar Zoe Todd calls good relation or right relation within community and within ecosystems. And so really this project, Oceanic Refractions, which was co-artistically produced with Mere Nalatikau, who is an Itauke Fijian, and also Jumeli Tukota, who is also from Fiji, and Leah Sadev Lavaki, who are our filmmakers, and Joseph Kamaru, who is the person we worked with sound. It really came out of these oral testimonies that people sat and gifted me with in this process, and Mere as well. And so this project, Oceanic Refractions, has been planned and underway. We really started building it in the last 18 months, but it has been going as part of a very long continuing project that will continue very much so into the future in different iterations.
I realize some of you have had the opportunity to be immersed in the installation itself. I know, Sinthujan, you have. And I wonder if you wanted to maybe expand, or share maybe some reflections on your experience, and especially considering what Amer has shared about how the project has come into being.
I think it was a very, of course, bodily experience in different layers and different ways, where you really experience the place as well as the circumstances through your own body, whilst kind of being away from that very place where it's being filmed and the stories that are being told. I thought it was a very beautifully and touching, but also devastating kind of testimony that reminds us also, specifically here in the colonial metropolis, of different relationships to our environments, to the ocean, to land. There were really beautiful and quite stunning quotes and testimonies by different activists, teachers, writers. One of them, I think, was saying that in one of the indigenous languages, land means people and people means land. And I really like the kind of exploration it allows us to also understand how language is a landscape, and how European imperial languages kind of like train us also to consider and to kind of position us towards our environment in a particular way. But then once we allow to feel the environment through a different language that doesn't even have to be a written or a spoken language, I think it opens up entirely new gateways. And I feel like this installation really kind of like felt like a gateway that allowed you to feel without necessarily having to understand, but actually just experience and feel and respect whatever you wouldn't understand even.
Yeah, I think that's a really beautiful point, and thank you so much. It's extremely meaningful to hear this from you, and I know that everybody that has worked on this project would find it very meaningful to hear this from you too. So what Sinthujan is speaking about is a statement by now past Kiribati poet and scholar Teveririki Tirero, and he talks about the word in Kiribati tiapa, which is the same word for land and for people. And Teveririki Tirero was a very important figure in the Pacific. So he took over the running of the Oceania Center at the University of the South Pacific in Fiji after the very renowned theorist and decolonization scholar Epeli Hau'ofa, who speaks about our Sea of Islands and talks about how when the colonizers came to the Pacific, they spoke about the Pacific as islands in a far sea, as these small, tiny, isolated islands that really are meaningful only in their tininess and their minusculeness. And he speaks about that actually we are great ocean states and not tiny island states, that really, the islands encompass all of the oceans. And Epeli actually, Hau'ofa, spoke a lot. He had very strong connections as well with decolonization movements around the world, in the Caribbean as well, like other decolonization writers and thinkers that were thinking through the ocean and thinking through oceanic relationships and the ocean as an agent itself in the movement of people and the movement of ideas around the world.
And I think specifically also speaking of where this is being exhibited, and what it really means also in relation to this country and its own historic and present role in relation to these places and people. And I think it's very striking and important also and critical to kind of like bring also these realities into the forefront, because I feel like a lot of times when we think about this particular part of the world from here, it's distant, it's abstract, it's very otherworldly almost, and I think it's imagined and constructed historically also from here as the so-called end of the world. And I think in that sense, I think a lot of times there's a little bit of an maybe embellished but also infantilized, patronizing kind of like attitude towards like different living beings on these islands. At the same time, the struggles are at the forefront and really leading and pushing a lot of notions. Like questions about like refugeehood. Like who is actually a refugee. Like there's so many like different kind of like struggles that really open up understandings of how we even relate to international law, that people in these regions really kind of like open and are at the forefront at.
Absolutely, and I think one of the, speaking directly to what you're saying, one of the kinds of distinctions that need to be made here. So there's a brilliant Pacific scholar who is sadly now also passed, Tracy Banavanuama, who talks about the difference across the regions in, a Pacific wayfinding peoples, people who always traveled, who always had this great mobility across the oceans, the difference in being forced to leave and choosing to wayfind, and how acute that difference is, especially when at this point in time, in states particularly like Tuvalu and Kiribati, one of the big conversations that are being had is what does it mean to be forced to be a climate refugee to countries like Australia and Aotearoa, New Zealand, where there is such a strong geopolitical hand that is played in the Pacific. And I think that's something we'll come back to in a little bit as well, is the geopolitics and the geoeconomics of that region, in which Germany also plays a role. But one of the things that I wanted to kind of say in terms of the representation of the Pacific in terms of environmental change is that there, maybe what most people here would be familiar with is this idea of climate heroes or victims. You see this media footage of people on the front lines as, either on the worst day of their life, you know, like, or overcoming this extreme struggle, you know. And this is something that Mere has talked about a lot, where she says, you know, we cannot create work where we are showing the worst days of people's lives. And she was talking yesterday in a panel that we gave for CTM about her background as a communications specialist across the region, and talking about, like, after a cyclone, journalists coming in from Australia and elsewhere and saying, you know, standing in a village that had been devastated, you know, with the houses knocked over and the fields knocked over, and saying, well, can you show us more devastation? You know, and this constant pressure on people within the region to show more and more of their trauma and devastation over and over again, and to either be upheld as victims or heroes that are, you know, dealing with a disaster that is, quite frankly, of our making here in Europe and Anglo-European countries. You know, and I think that what people also, you know, that I spoke about, like, there's a group called 350 Pacific, you know, this constant pressure to perform to the white gaze in the right way, to be discernible and legible to the white gaze so that people will pay attention or give money or offer support or change their behavior or pressure their governments into behaving differently. That is always this taking away of dignity. And what does it mean to actually speak to one's reality with dignity, not always to this, like, the gaze of the white donor that is coming in. And I think, you know, we made a lot of decisions about this project, and one of the main decisions with the work, for those who have seen it, is you never get the opportunity to see Black and Indigenous bodies in this work. And that's a very specific decision, because especially for white Europeans, being able to see that is a distancing measure. It's happening over there, it's happening to someone else, it's not happening to us, and that is a lie. You know, the whole point of this work is about the interconnectedness of all of us that live on this planet, and the understanding that all liberation is tied together, and we can't actually achieve any liberation without that understanding of interdependence and interconnectivity. So I think really with this work and with these ideas, what we're trying to say is, you know, just as in Europe, everybody here has different ideas and different experiences and different desires and different things, so do people in the Pacific, you know, and people are full of contradictions and have different experiences and different perspectives, and that's also what we want to show. We want to show also the very boring and mundane everyday lives that people experience, even in the most terrible moments of disaster. People are still having birthday parties and still eating meals with their families and still, you know, celebrating one another and taking care of one another. And that is deeply at the heart of this work, is the care that people take of one another.
I think I want to actually pick up on something that you mentioned, which is this question of distancing and the geoeconomies at play underneath. Sometimes visible, and sometimes not so visible. And I wonder if you could maybe speak a little bit more about that, especially for those who aren't aware of, for example, the role of Germany, or maybe we can just say Europe, or maybe Germany, in this particular kind of imaginary that's not only created but sort of reified through these images that were shown.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think for many of, you know, the audience, when you enter the space, the images are beautiful. The Pacific is beautiful. It's a beautiful place, you know. Most people know it as a tourism, you know, and I think Sinthujan can talk about this at great length in a little moment, like about the kind of allure of island states as touristic hotspots, and that as a form, again, of capitalistic extraction. You know, this idea that, oh, this is a beautiful place to kind of go and have a beach holiday, you know, snorkeling, scuba diving, but also, you know, within academia and the arts, a place where you can go and speak to people about, again, climate crisis, you know, a place for research extraction as well, you know, and I think that particularly from the European context, and you know, we've been talking about this recently. I think Sinthujan and I also mentioned this. Like, Germany has very recently just opened up an embassy in Fiji after not having been there for a long time. So we always have to question, why is this happening now? Why is Germany now interested in the Pacific again, you know? And I mean, Germany has been a colonizing state in the Pacific. In the 1800s and 1900s, Germany colonized Samoa, they annexed Nauru, you know, they were in Papua New Guinea. I mean, it's still called the Bismarck Sea in Papua New Guinea. You know, Germany was all over the Pacific, and Germany was also a country that started up plantations in Samoa and in Papua New Guinea, and was very active in the blackbirding and indentured servitude of people to those plantations to do the work to send money back over to Germany. So Germany has been in the Pacific, and you know, I really noticed this, like when I was in Nauru, someone was talking to me and they were speaking German, like there were German words in Nauruan, and I was like, what the fuck? Like, where am I right now? And then we spoke about it, and they're like, yeah, because Germany colonized us, you know? Germany was the country that started extracting phosphate from Nauru, which has ultimately led to the extreme environmental destruction of Nauru, you know, where 80% of the island is now uninhabitable. And that was a process that was started off by Germany. And I think, you know, more broadly in this country, people don't learn much about the other genocides that have been, you know, activated through the German state. But the legacies and the histories and the traces are all still there, you know, very much in the Pacific as well, you know. And I'll pass it over to you.
Picking up on that, I think in Germany specifically, I think a lot of the discussions around German colonialism, you know, like really reduced themselves geographically speaking towards the African continent. And there's very little interest and also research funds and other, just resources really put into understanding Germany's role in creating what is considered the Pacific region, and also the kind of devastation and impact Germany still has, you know, and the kind of responsibilities Germany's actually never took and never responded towards, you know. And I think in many ways, like, Germany got rid of that reality and the repercussions of that quite smartly. And there's very little understanding either. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that the geographical distance that really also makes transport and communication so difficult and expensive. But then, and that also like adds up on the fact that a lot of the populations, like there's not a significant amount of, you know, like indigenous people and other people from these regions who actually live in these countries, in Germany specifically, which also means that there are rarely, you know, like community-driven efforts, you know, of bringing it to the forefront, you know, at government levels or in other institutions. And I think that actually really shapes also how in discussions on German colonialism specifically, there's a clear blindsiding of this huge aspect and huge part of the world that Germany has colonized, you know, and where these traces are still very visible, but not necessarily acknowledged as they should be.
Yeah, and I actually just wanted to say to that, because it popped to my mind again. You know, I mean, I think the German relationship to this kind of like, again, it's an artificial distance, you know, like there is not temporally, and you know, there's not actually a distance there. Germans are there, the German embassy is there, you know, Germans are there on holidays. I think you were saying people just pop over to Bali, you know, and things like this, like, you know. But we found a review of the work the other day where, and I'm not saying this in any kind of mean way, but it was just very illuminating, where the writer of the review referred to it as the continent of Oceania. And just, I mean, it was a beautiful idea, and look, like all of the Fijians were like, oh, cool, we're a continent, you know, but like that level of ignorance, you know, is just astonishing. And I understand it's in no way malicious, but it's just so profoundly clear.
But I question the honesty of even pretending that there's an ignorance, because when you go to flea markets or when you go into museums, you see all of that. In every single ethnographic museum of Germany, you find boats from, Papua New Guinea and other places. You find all these kind of statues, imageries. You find the souvenir postcards. You have everything, just laid out there. There's a lot of research. There's a lot of actually publications, even in German, about these parts of the world. And I think, even like in the language, you find the traces in German, like when we were discussing, I was speaking about the two terms that are used in both East and West Germany to denigrate guest laborers, GastarbeiterInnen. In East Germany, it's Fiji, which is used as a racial derogatory term to address specifically Vietnamese and North Korean guest laborers. And in West Germany, it was Kanake, which from some Kanaki, which is still used, as a racial derogatory term to describe specifically, initially people from the Mediterranean region, but now specifically Middle Easterners, North Africans, And in that rhetorical kind of like reusage and reappropriation, as well as repurposing, of forms of dehumanization and subjugation, you understand that there's actually a memory that confronts this pretense of an amnesia. And a lot of it has to actually do with the fact that Germany, in many ways, as you were saying, like it created these plantation economies, enslaved, abducted people, and a lot of these terms traveled through the labor relationships. And they were then imposed on new laborers who were in the history from slavery to indentured labor to contract laborers attached to that genealogy. And I think this specific kind of like rhetorical and semantic kind of like landscape really showcases also, like how these words traveled, because the words Kanake and Fiji traveled to German, like colonists, who were taking these words and bringing them towards Hamburg, and then they were repurposing them, and the meanings changed. And then suddenly, at this point of history, you have, not necessarily in regards to the term Fiji, and I think this is what I find really frustrating, there's an abstraction of the actual people who exist. In this country, like no one thinks about that Kanake are actually real people, colonized people, by France, who are still fighting for the independence. And no one thinks about the fact that these people actually exist. And you have different populations, Middle Easterners and North Africans, who now reclaim, or call it a form of reclaiming, where they really continue this legacy of kind of writing out these people out of existence and continuing their denigration by pretending that they don't exist.
And this also comes to, this also brings to mind some of the questions that we've talked about as well, I mean, individually and also together, is the question of legitimacy, the legitimacy of testimony in particular. And there's something happening in parallel here, and I think in parts of this conversation where there's this questions of legitimacy, of testimonies, of erasure, of forgetting, and then the abstraction of those who may be able to deliver that testimony, or who have already delivered that testimony, and yet their sort of personhood is forgotten. And I wonder if we could think about that in relation to the work itself, because you said earlier you explicitly made the choice not to show bodies, to allow for that kind of gaze. But then I'm also thinking of the testimonies of, non-human inhabitants of these places, and I'm wondering, sorry, this is a bit of a little roundabout, but it'll make sense in a moment. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the scent that you used, and how that, the scent, yes, the scent in the room, in the installation, and what that meant to you, why that was so important, and how that, I think, takes away a lot of that abstraction for those who can recognize that scent.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll speak to a couple of different things. One of the things with this project is, well, actually two things with this project is incommensurability and unintelligibility. And both those aspects are extremely important in this project because, you know, I'll just say this very briefly. So across the region, well, number one, across the region, there is no arts funding, right? So people do not have any opportunity to get funding from their governments to make the arts. That is just not a thing that exists. A lot of people who are filmmakers or musicians get roped into projects by the United Nations Development Programme or the World Bank and other massive corporations to make either kind of very touristically driven or, you know, a very particular kind of representation of the Pacific in terms of sustainable development and the blue economy, or to make virtual reality programs around climate change, you know, which is where you see children bereft of their houses and, you know, all of the kind of trauma porn that people are very kind of familiar with, you know. And so one of the things that we worked very hard in this piece was to make sure that none of that was present. You know, it was very adamantly not present. And the ways that we kind of worked with that was, you know, we thought very much about disability accessibility in this work. And we were thinking about, you know, should we subtitle the work so that people can understand? But we decided against it because we thought, no, the whole point of this is that particularly for white Europeans, that we have to struggle to understand somebody else for once, you know, and turning this around into something where it's like, this is a question for us about how we listen, because one of the things, and we can also talk about this, is the kind of the moral virtue and the moral good, you know, particularly that countries that, like Germany, have this idea of themselves as environmentalists, hold of this idea of like we're caretakers of the planet and what other rot. But like, that was really something where we thought, you know, we did offer people transcripts because the work needs to be accessible, but really to play with that edge of intelligibility, that edge of being able to hear, you know, and also obviously sensorially through the body as well, because we don't just listen with the ears. But in terms of what you're talking about with the scent, after Cyclone Winston hit, a good friend of ours, who's a marine biologist, was asked by communities to go out to the island of Lau, where the cyclone hit it made direct contact with land. And Lau is a small island community, a small community there. And she was describing to us the smell of the beach after the cyclone, you know, and it was a smell that I grew up on a boat. I grew up on a boat in the Pacific and then also on a small island, and it was a smell that was familiar to me. But the way that she described it is she was talking about the mutton birds and the frigate birds that had been washed up on the shore, and the oily smell of the decomposing frigate birds mixed with the smell of the decomposing fish. And she said, you know, it was the first time that she had ever seen, as a marine biologist, so many species of fish washed on land. And she said, you know, it was like the contents of the sea had been put onto the land. And over the time that she was working there, you know, over a week, because she had to do all of these different, you know, like counting things and stuff, she was saying like the smell just grew and grew, like this very particular smell of death. And that was something that we really wanted to work with, the destabilizing smell of the ocean, not this like ocean that's a beautiful, you know, holiday ocean, this fantasy of the ocean, but the real ocean. And she actually wrote a wonderful poem about it in an audio piece that we made called In the Eye of the Storm. And she talks about it, you know, like the real ocean, my ocean, not your beautiful holiday ocean. And that was really where the smell came from, was trying to evoke that smell. And what's been really interesting in a lot of feedback that we've gotten from people is that, you know, from people who come from other places that are really sea-based places, that particular combination of that petrol, mineral, rot, fish, seaweed thing also very much evokes like working harbors, you know, and actual understandings of the ocean, that like actual lived experiences of the ocean that people have. So yeah, there was a real interplay there continuously with like this kind of view that is you know, like the facade and the reality of what is in there.
No, you can go.
I think also, well, no, sorry, that's like actually a lot to think about. I think with that also, this question of, intelligibility and incommensurability also brings us, can bring us back to this question of the way the Pacific, but maybe not only the Pacific, maybe this is a question to open up more about islands in general, how they're represented in terms of not only environmental change, but also sort of like economies of representation, in particular on various platforms where they can be leveraged or instrumentalized. And I mean that, in many ways, not necessarily positive or negative, not just a simple binary. And I wonder, maybe, Sinthujan, if you could talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah, sure, I can, or I will try. I always think about like islands, as very specific places, places that are very difficult to grasp for people who don't come from islands. And like I was saying, history is mainly written from so-called mainlands, not from islands. And people in islands oftentimes have to refer and are considered, adjacent to a mainland. It's mostly the mainland that also dominates the islands, and it's that place that kind of has a grasp over everything that happens on the island. And island economies are at this point oftentimes also so deeply entrenched in industries of tourism that, and you've seen that particularly with the pandemic, how unsustainable they became suddenly, like when the planes stopped arriving and suddenly people had to kind of like turn into different modes of actually living and surviving. And I think nowadays, I think islands also in colonial histories are mostly the first places to be colonized, conquered, and the last places where the colonizers leave. When you think about the amount of formal colonies Europe still holds, it's mostly island territories. The European Union technically stretches all the way to the Caribbean, all the way to the Pacific, and it's islands that stretch it. So-called New Caledonia, Kanaki, is a case in point, or St. Helena in the Caribbean and other places, or Réunion, and there's so many like different examples where you really see how islands are territories that are completely contested, but also have now, at this point of history, also become completely dependent, almost resigned to this reality of dependency and an existence only through some foreign, distant capital. And I think in the Pacific specifically, I think we keep on seeing, as you were saying, like Germany opened a new embassy in Fiji, and Fiji is also a place where many other countries also have embassies. And it's not necessarily because Fiji really plays this big, like role, but rather because of the fact that China has emerged, as a party that is now really, has invested a lot, into kind of like outreaching, expanding the sphere of influence, but also undermining Taiwan, as a country that still tries to establish itself or separate itself, from Chinese claims, of annexation. And a lot of these contests and these struggles happen actually in the Pacific, with China and Taiwan competing around investments into local economies, into infrastructure and other projects as a matter of fact of kind of stabilizing their own sovereignty and their claims. And these places suddenly become the battleground for a completely different region in the world.
Yeah, and to add to that, like the Pacific is still the place in the world that holds the most colonized states in the world today. And I think that is a really profound realization, considering that, again, the Pacific Ocean is a third of the world, and that so many states are still held in these geopolitical strongholds, particularly exacerbated now by the needs of states to kind of shore up finances for climate aid. And one of the things, that is talked about a lot is, particularly amongst researchers is, oh, Indigenous knowledge, like everybody's now getting really excited about Indigenous knowledge. But the reality is there is absolutely no way that any of these states can do anything, any forms of adaptation and mitigation to actually hold back the intensity of what is coming again and again in terms of like cyclones and floods and droughts and coral bleaching and salination of soil and warming water. Like it's really something that cannot be contained by any one state. And I think, this also ties very much horribly, ironically, with the rush for the Pacific again now in terms of deep seabed mining, because what is being looked at to be mined is cobalt and iron and minerals that are used in renewable energy. And so it is another form of greenwashing where countries around the world are rushing for the Pacific to buy up the licenses which they leverage through states like Nauru, which is economically a very dependent nation on Australian aid and different foreign countries' aid. And so Nauru goes into partnerships to have exploration licenses to different countries that come in. And, I have to say, like, recently it was the Pacific Islands Forum and the Cook Islands, people were handing out deep sea nodules to people that had come from as far away, like delegations as far away as Israel and Saudi Arabia, coming into the Pacific to, develop these partnerships that are ongoing anyway because they already exist through militarization. The Pacific being a very important military base for the US and, as you say, China, Australia, other countries that are coming in. I mean, the history of nuclear testing in the region in itself, So there are all of these histories that are entangled with the impacts of climate crisis. And then on top of this, the absolute pillaging of the ocean, not only through extraction for fishing and things like that as like one of the, most verdant and last available fishing areas, but also now for deep seabed mining so that countries like over here, we can talk about our renewable energy and look how good we are doing while we are mining the Pacific.
I also think, because you were mentioning atomic, nuclear tests,
Yeah.
I think a lot of islands are also testing grounds,
Yes.
And there are places where mainland countries and larger metropolises really like test out and play out, like things that wouldn't have the same repercussions, because they're contained in its impact. When we think about, for instance, now in the UK, the debate about offshore detention, for instance, so-called Australia was at the forefront of creating these offshore detention centers in Manus Island and Nauru, and they've closed them down, which also meant that Nauru now has like this huge, gap in its own GDP and in its financial kind of viability. And I think in that sense, I think it's also important to think about the fact of how, like these places that look from here so remote on the map, are actually so central to a lot of like world making and stabilizing of this imperial capitalist world order, and how we cannot afford to actually write these places out of history and out of, like the importance and meaning for our existence. And a lot of times I feel like even in these climate debates, if these places are being, mentioned, named, and even reported about, it's not necessarily for the places themselves, but rather, like for what it means for us here, So these places just become projection spaces, and they don't stand on their own, and they're not allowed to even speak in their own, And I think when the Prime Minister of Tuvalu, last year announced that Tuvalu will become the first digital nation and that they will upload Tuvalu into the cloud, it was some were debating whether it was just a PR kind of, move or whether it's actually happening. But I think it is a response to the kind of like ignorance and apathy of this part of the world to actually do something. When we think about what happened at COP28, in the UAE, I mean, all the kind of like groundwork, like that activists, like thinkers, everyday people, like we're doing in the Pacific Island regions, fighting for a different world, we're completely ignored by, of course, an ironic or cynically held climate conference in the UAE, where change around fossil economies were being discussed, but then undermined by lobbyists. And I think that type of just laissez-faire attitude, like towards the Pacific, but also I think island nations in general, because I think even like in the so-called Indian Ocean, you have similar, like the Maldives, like in other places, they fight very similar struggles, but these struggles are not necessarily, they're belittled oftentimes, because these populations and these economies are not as significant for these colonial metropolises.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think this question of relation is an important one because it's a very, it changes quite often. This sort of like who is in relation to whom for what, right? So if we think about this question of, and maybe we can also talk about this a little bit more, this question of ecocide, for example, and trying to understand, you know, first of all, just grappling with what that term means, both actually, and then what does that mean legally within different contexts and frameworks, and who is deploying that term to what ends, to protect what, to conserve, you know, what, for example. So I'm wondering if you could talk about this maybe a little bit in the context of these particular, in your experience in these particular geographies, and then maybe we can expand the conversation a bit more.
Absolutely. So with Oceanic Refractions, we have an advisory board of Pacific elders and other people who hold different sorts of chiefly titles and things within the region. And one of our members of our advisory board is Fleur Ramsey, who works with Blue Ocean Law, which is an Indigenous Pacific law firm that specifically, you know, works around issues of climate justice and social justice. And at the moment, they've been very actively involved in the petition that Vanuatu put together with 132 other nations to the ICJ around, you know, asking questions around the loss of life and damages due to climate change, you know, and are bringing this to the ICJ. And there are multiple, you know, I mean, I think, as you said as well, when countries become very dependent on donors and very dependent constantly on portraying themselves in a specific way to be legible and to be heard, and having to walk, as many people have said to me, the corridors of power. You know, I know, for instance, that a lot of Pacific activists this year did not go to COP because the level of frustration and just grief of having to go and prostrate themselves over and over again. You know, I mean, Fleur also said in the talk yesterday that, you know, in the Pacific, 98% of the reefs will be wiped out when we get to 1 degree of rise, and we've already hit over 1.5. You know, and the amount of times that Pacific Islanders have had to go to these conferences and, you know, spaces of policy and law to say, you know, 1.5 to stay alive, like all of the different slogans in so many different ways, and nobody listens. You know, I mean, now perhaps talking about loss and damages, but how can you quantify the loss of an entire place? You know, entire peoples just completely gone because of climate change, you know. And I think that's the thing. It's like there are all of these different ways that people are trying to fight and trying to advocate and petition, but it's always coming back into the same kind of circuitry, you know. And ultimately, you know, when you speak to people in the community that are doing grassroots level work, you know, there is a complete loss of faith as well in any of these processes. You know, people know, we go, no one listens to us. You know, we go and nothing actually changes. And it's almost like the understanding of what is available, what is possible, gets smaller and smaller and smaller every time, you know. And I know, like you said, with Tuvalu, you know, like to actually grasp what it means for an entire country to feel like the only option they have left is to digitize themselves into the metaverse. You know, that is one of the hardest things. Like when I heard that, I was like, wow, that's not even something that can truly be spoken about, to grasp that incommensurable level of loss. You know, a culture and a society that has been around for like tens of thousands of years to just be, what, in the metaverse now, you know? And that is not a cynical ploy. That is not some kind of like, you know, well, this is us now. It's not some, you know, kind of, this is the reality of what people are facing. You know, and I think like when it gets so abstracted into these processes, yes, those are the processes that people feel are available to them, but the processes are rotten. Sorry, I don't know what else to say about that. Sorry.
What I find interesting is that the disregard in regards to these, you know, like questions of survival of these island inhabitants vis-a-vis if you juxtaposition it to how these islands are instrumentalized, for instance, in larger kind of like international state mechanisms, like the UN, the Security Council, or the UN Human Rights Council, where a lot of the islands have similar, the voting pattern or voting weight equates to the one of, of a little island, equates to that of France, maybe, which also means that a lot of times, a lot of these islands are also swayed, lured, into political maneuverisms that are then used to push for certain types of politics. We've seen that with China and Taiwan, but we also see it, with Israel, for instance, as well. Israel also does a similar thing. They have a historical relationship as being one of the first countries to recognize a lot of these new independent island states, which also means that a lot of these island states feel a certain sense of gratitude and loyalty also towards Israel, which also means when you think about the UN Human Rights Council patterns in terms of like voting for ceasefires or not, you constantly see there's 6 Pacific Island nations that most people here don't even know about, or don't even know where they are, what they are, who they are, that constantly, vote in favor of maybe what also the US would vote for.
Yeah,
and
but I'll just interrupt and say specifically that, I think for a lot of people, like when I spoke to people, they're like, what the hell is the Federated States of Micronesia? Or why is Nauru, voting with Israel? And then, as I said before, if you think back to things like the Pacific Islands Forum, you've got countries like Israel coming in and offering support to countries that are economically really beyond devastated, and the ways that they have the possibility of getting an economy again is through things like extractives, deep seabed mining. And when you have these other countries coming in and saying, hey, we will help you, we will give you money, in communities where there is no, basically, an economy anymore, what are people meant to do?
And I think it's a very, I guess on the flip side, you have other, examples, like for instance, West Papua being colonized by Indonesia, and Indonesia being one of the first proponents and supporters of Palestine, who then also support the ICJ court case, and also have also submitted their own court case, whilst, being the colonizers of West Papua, and doing terrible things on an everyday scale that no one really recognizes, knows about, hears about, because these places are so abstracted. And even in solidarity movements, in leftist kind of like organizing here, there's very little space, acknowledgement, even interest in these places, because they're so removed from the mental and emotional landscape. And I think that is such a devastating and tragic state.
Yeah. I mean, the silencing, particularly in Europe, about West Papua, which has been, the resistance has been going on for so many decades now, that is such a huge kind of thing as well, particularly in the relationships with Indonesia, and the particular fantasies around Bali as well, like you were saying, that's these points, there's always these points of erasure, these points that people kind of block out in a certain kind of way for different kinds of reasons and different kinds of strategic and geopolitical reasons as well.
How much time do we have left?
It's 3
Yeah.
3 minutes.
3 minutes.
Do you want to do one more question?
No, we can end now.
Okay. Okay, I will defer to you. Thank you both so much for your time. Thank you both so much for meeting tonight in particular, and sharing both of your work so generously and so beautifully. In particular, upstairs, it's really incredible. If you do, I know it's sold out, I think. But if you do have the chance to sort of wait by the door if someone doesn't show up, do try to see it, or hopefully we'll see it in future iterations somewhere not so far away. If you want actually more information, you can go to the project website. You can go to CTM's website, of course, but then there's the project website, oceanicrefractions.org. And I will leave it there. Thank you all so much. We will have another conversation in just a few moments as well. So thank you.